My name is Rob Ritchie. I'm Executive Director of FairVote, and this is the fourth in our series of Democracy Next forums that we have been pleased to do with NYU Dialogues. Happy to welcome you to the Abramson Family Auditorium here at NYU's newest global site for this very important discussion on the impact of women's representation. As you may know, this is the fourth event in our series, we are posting all of the previous forums at democracynext.com. So you can actually, this is being live streamed. It's also being, we're being joined by C-SPAN today. You can see every forum that's taken place and those that'll keep going in the future at democracynext.com. And it's really been an exciting series so far. We've had members of Congress. We've had timely topics about a right to vote in the Constitution just after the Voting Rights Act was weakened by the Supreme Court. And today is a particularly important topic for us because it's about something that's at the heart of our democracy, which is fair representation. I welcome you. And I also am very pleased to have Cynthia Terrell take on the task of introducing today's topic. She is the chair of Representation 2020, which is a new project and has a new report. And Cynthia Terrell.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. As Rob said, my name is Cynthia Terrell, and I'm on the board and also on the staff at FairVote. And I'm also the new chair of our Representation 2020 project that seeks to broaden the discussion of measures to increase the number of women in elected office by acknowledging the fabulous work that's being done by many groups and individuals, and also highlight 3 areas of structural changes that we think demand more attention. The first of those is encouraging political parties to nominate and recruit more women to run for office. The second is promoting legislative practices that advantage women as candidates and as elected officials. And the third is for advocating for electoral systems that allow more women to win in the first place. Before joining the FairVote team, I worked for many years on campaigns for state, local, and national offices. And through this, I learned firsthand the challenges that all candidates, but particularly women, face in the process of being a candidate, securing the proper nomination papers, and so forth. And I really learned firsthand that these stem not only from societal norms and stereotypes against women, but also from the basic structure of our voting system itself. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Representation 2020 began last summer when some of us began to think about the centennial of the 19th Amendment and ways to celebrate that momentous occasion. It didn't take long for us to realize the best way to honor the decades-long struggle for suffrage was an energized push for representation. Thus, our motto was born, a century from suffrage to parity. So to that end, we've sought funding, created a website, formed a leadership circle, fashioned a 6-point Representation 2020 pledge, and decided to release a report also on the status of women's representation, which is the subject of today's forum. And we're going to release that report on the anniversary of the ratification and passage of the amendment. We're in a great time right now because Sunday was the anniversary of the 93rd ratification when Tennessee became the final state necessary for suffrage to be a legitimate reality for women in this country. And then on Monday, we celebrate Women's Equality Day, which acknowledges that transformation where half the population was able to join the world as suffering citizens, I guess you would say, suffraging citizens. We really are keen on this report as a device to assess the state of women's representation, highlight the best practices, and generate a deeper discussion about how to get more women elected in this country. So to that end, we're also doing a little fun media work, and we have a video that some folks have helped us put together that we'll show now.
Democracy is at its best when we all have a seat at the table. But in America, there's a big gap. We need more women in office. Men hold 82% of the seats in the House of Representatives. A decade ago, our nation ranked behind 57 nations in the percentage of women in Congress. Today, we're 92nd. Out of 50 governors, just 5 are women. That's 10%, the same percentage as the number of women mayors in our 100 largest cities. Out of more than 7,000 state legislators, fewer than 1 in 4 are women. That's barely higher than it was 2 decades ago. At this rate, women will be underrepresented in the United States for another 500 years. A century ago, in 1920, the decades-long struggle for women to win the right to vote culminated in the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Inspired by that struggle, Representation 2020 takes on this century's challenge for women. We must have parity for women in office. That will happen when in any given election, a woman is just as likely as a man to win, and in any given legislature, women will be just as likely to hold the most seats. I founded the White House Project, where we trained thousands of women to run for office. Such work is essential, but it's not enough. It's time for a new vision and new approaches. Our vision is simple. Let's not settle for anything less than parity. We support the full spectrum of activity promoting election of more women with our Representation 2020 pledge. Representation 2020 advocates for structural solutions to the problem. Parties should pass rules that institutionalize a commitment to recruiting and nominating more women. Legislatures should have family-friendly policies to ensure more women can serve effectively and rise to leadership. Our elections need to be more inclusive. We should change rules so that we have more than one representative. States with multi-member districts elect more women, and more than half of their voters today are represented by a woman. In those new districts, we seek fair representation voting rules that will give everyone a better chance to elect their favorite candidates. That's democracy, and that's what America is all about. Let's live our values. Join us in celebrating a century of suffrage with a commitment to parity. Visit representation2020.com to sign our pledge and help us make history.
Keeping with our goal of deepening this conversation, we have a terrific panel here today. We're so grateful that all of you are here. We are going to be talking about this report in 3 sections. Patricia Hart and Andrea Levian from the Representation 2020 staff are going to be presenting each part of the report, and then our panelists will have a chance to respond to the specifics in those sections. So let me turn to introducing our panel, which will be moderated by the famous Marie Wilson of video fame now. But she is also the founder and former president of the White House Project, an organization that advocated for women's leadership positions and ultimately for the presidency, a shocking thought. In addition to conducting significant research on women in media, politics, and business, Ms. Wilson is co-creator of Take Our Daughters and Sons to Work Day, which started in 1993, and served as head of the Ms. Foundation for Women, a national advocacy group dedicated to fighting for women's rights, and created the Marie C. Wilson Leadership Fund in honor of her achievements. In addition to being a renowned speaker, writer, and leader in the women's rights movement, Ms. Wilson has the distinction of being the first woman elected to the Des Moines City Council as a member at large in 1983. Joining Marie is Celinda Lake, who is one of the Democratic Party's leading political strategists and one of the nation's foremost experts on electing women candidates and on framing issues to women voters. American politics calls Celinda a super strategist, or better yet, the godmother. Thank you. And Working Women says she was arguably the most influential woman in her field. She's renowned for her groundbreaking research on single women voters in conjunction with Women's Voices Women Vote, and has helped elect numerous female candidates, including Barbara Mikulski, former Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano, Blanche Lincoln, and so forth and so on. Celinda Lake also worked for Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House. In 2005, she and Kellyanne Conway published What Women Really Want, and I'm pleased to say that we invited Kellyanne to join us today, and I think she might well have been here, but a scheduling conflict prevented her from attending. But we're very glad for her interest in this topic as well. And Laura Liswood, who's Secretary General of the Council of Women, World Leaders, and Senior Advisor at Goldman Sachs. The work of the Council expands the understanding of leadership, establishes a network of resources for high-level women leaders, and provides a forum for the group to contribute input and shape the international issues important to women and society. In 1997, Liswood co-founded the White House Project. Her work with women presidents and prime ministers was the inspiration for the project to change the cultural message in the United States about women as leaders. From 1992 to 1996, as director of the Women's Leadership Project, Liswood identified global leadership contribution from women heads of state. She interviewed 15 current and former women presidents and prime ministers, which is chronicled in her book and video documentary, Women World Leaders. Her latest book, The Loudest Duck, interesting title, is a business guide that uses parables and anecdotes to examine the challenges to traditional workplace diversity efforts and provides innovative strategies to create truly effective workplaces for all. Also joining us when we get to the part of the discussion about the very important work of training and recruiting and supporting women candidates will be Jess McIntosh, who's the communications director from Emily's List. We're very glad that she is here with us today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Levian, who is the report's chief orchestrator extraordinaire, and she's going to provide you an introduction to the report. Thanks very much for all being here.
Hi, I'm Andrea Levian, and I'm a research associate at FairVote and at Representation 2020. When we were compiling this report, we wanted to look at it in two ways. The first was, what is the state of women's representation in the United States right now, and how far away are we from parity? And then also look at new methods and older methods that could help improve the representation of women in government. So I think I'm going to start off by just telling you how far away we are from parity. We currently rank 92nd in the world for the percentage of women in our national legislature. 80 countries have had a woman head of state. We have not. Right now, there are only 5 women governors out of our 50 states, and 24 states have never elected a woman governor. In 1993, the year after the Year of the Woman, 22% of state elected executive officials, so secretaries of state, lieutenant governors, all of those, were women, and we are now 1 percentage point higher at 23%. Right after the Year of the Woman, about 20% of state legislators were women, and now we're at 24%. And right now, we only have 20% women senators and 18% women congressmen. So we clearly have a long way to go. So I think what I'd like to start our panelists on is, why do you think that we are at this stagnating level of women's representation over the last 20 or so years, and what do you think are the main things that we need to do to improve women's representation?
I am so delighted that you started us. This is good. I thought I had to get a great question going. Why do we think? Yeah, the three of us have worked a lot together on this issue, and of course have heard these facts unfortunately, for many years. But I think it's very hard for all three of us, in particular Laura, when she's out in the world, to try to explain to people what is holding the United States back, and why do we rank so low, and why are we still in this place? Because if you look at the thing that I think most surprises me, is that the Year of the Woman became the year of our downfall. In essence, we have not increased the number of women in state legislatures more than maybe 1% or 2% since then. So I think I'll start with you, because you've been doing research on this for so many years and know all of what's behind the stagnation of democracy.
Yeah. So it's a really, really interesting question, and I would say that there are so many things we could just do an hour on this, and your report is excellent in terms of subsequently answering some of the questions in terms of structural features, recruitment problems. But I'd say that there are kind of 3 basic barriers to women. One barrier to women is that not enough run. And you have some very interesting data on the party recruitment and the gender gap in that. Some of the most vivid data, I think, is we did a study once of men and women in the pipeline, heads of organizations, people who were Chamber of Commerce members, Ivy League graduates, And 73% of the men said, yes, someone has always said to me, Joe, you should run for office. And 73% of the women said, no, no one's ever said to me, Susie, you should run for office. And out of that came a lot of efforts, the efforts that the White House Project did in terms of really getting in at the grassroots, the efforts that Emily's List did in terms of Ask a Woman. But even with those efforts, there's still a lot in our society that reinforces the ambition of every Boys Nation president or delegate to look in the mirror and see a U.S. senator and a president, and Women's Nation delegates to see themselves running nonprofits or doing something that would, quote unquote, be more valuable than politics. The second thing I think that we have is some of the structural features, and we're going to talk about that, I think, at length. And proportional representation, multi-member districts you mentioned. If I could add one to that list, I would add campaign finance reform. Mm-hmm. And it's not that women can't raise money, because thanks to the efforts of Emily's List, the Women's Campaign Fund, and others, women can raise money. But the problem is they don't want to. They don't want to spend their time doing this. If they're going to raise money, they want to raise money for the safe house in their neighborhood or the girls' club. They don't want to raise money to run for office. And women think it's an obscene amount of money that's spent on political office. And we now dominate. Women now dominate the purchase of everything. We're even 51% of technology purchases. We are the vast majority of charitable contributions. Over 2/3 of charitable contributions come from women. We are significantly less than half. We're only about 1/4 of political contributions. Women don't buy politics. And even when women write a check, they usually write the check at half the size of men at their same income level. And then women candidates don't have the money networks. I mean, how many of us have sat down with the kitchen cabinet or the finance committee of men, and there are all these high-powered lawyers, et cetera, and the women have their best friends and the head of United Way and their high school roommate there, but they don't have the money networks there. And in fact, women have now said in a new study that Parity put out that said that the number one thing that they need is not just training, but networking, even more than training. They know how to raise money, they just don't have the Rolodexes to raise it from. And then I think that there is a third factor, and that is the combination of family and running. And the data in this report reveals some really astounding data in terms of men with young children running, women with young children not running. And in fact, when voters, and we mark the history of a woman running in New York City, where you all are, and delivering a baby while she's running, good for her, but brave of her, because when voters see a man with young children, they never have any question about whether he's going to be able to take care of the job and the kids. With a woman, they go, well, who's going to take care of the kids? And if they're not asking that, then they ask, well, what if the kids have a crisis? Who's going to take care of the state? And we still find that there are a lot more questions asked by women of how would I manage this with my family, and asked by voters of how would I manage this by my family. And then the last thing I would say is, on the one hand, voters have a great appetite for women. They have an appetite for change. But I think it's a very smart point, Marie, that you made of our peak was also the beginning of our decline, because women now don't represent the same amount of change they used to represent. Even though we're still in paltry numbers, voters go, what do you mean? We've got women. We've got Sarah Palin. We've got Hillary Clinton. I'm not going to vote for a woman just because she's a woman. And if I had a nickel for every person who has said in a poll, I could donate all the polling to Parity Project for free. When in our focus groups or in our surveys, people go, well, I'll vote for a woman if she's qualified. No one ever asks, well, I'll vote for a man if he's qualified. And of course, the men have done such a bang-up job, you can really understand why nobody questions their qualifications. So what are voters putting in that package, qualified? And the Barbara Lee Foundation has done very, very interesting research on how do women overcome that double bind of being both a change agent but qualified enough for the job.
That about covers it.
Laura. Yes, well, Ibid, whatever she says.
Yeah,
I
no,
agree
that's
with.
right.
Well, I think clearly, some of the things that Celinda's talking about are definitely actors in this, what I call the headwinds and the tailwinds, and perhaps it's because I travel too much. But the fact is that this double bind issue that you're talking about, which is that how women are perceived as leaders versus how men are perceived as leaders, and the whole issue of the likability versus the leadership, and that for a man, if he shows assertive leadership, he can be considered likable. But for a woman, if she shows assertive leadership, she will not be considered likable. If she's considered likable, she is not considered a leader. The quote is that assertive men invade small countries. Assertive women put you on hold on the telephone. So you have this double bind, and I think that's being looked at and extensively, and some of the issues that the report looks at in terms of gender stereotypes does with that. But clearly, as you look around the world, the structural issues are critical, and that's why this project is so very important. Because invariably the systems that you look at in other countries and why there are more women heads of state, heads of government, et cetera, are the structural issues. And clearly we have a high hurdle on that to change these into the multi-member districts, et cetera. It's not impossible. Change goes from the unthinkable to the impossible to the inevitable. We're just trying to push this along a little bit. In addition, what's also very interesting for me, also dealing with the corporate world, is that there are 5% women governors. There are 4% women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So the parallel is actually quite prevalent between what happens with women in business and what happens with women in the political sphere. And obviously the family issues and the work-life balance issues, Catalyst has done a lot of research on this and has found that is a big point of it. Another big point of why women don't become CEOs or become governors is the networking. Some of the research shows that men have broad and shallow networks, and women have narrow and deep networks. And if you're trying to raise money, you need a broad network of people to raise money. In addition, besides the family-friendly issues and the networking, are the opportunities to have the kinds of leadership roles, in the case of the corporate world, are the profit and loss, the operational roles, and often women don't get to those kinds of operational roles. And then finally, there are the issues of the gender stereotypes that exist about, who should be doing these kinds of things, and you were referencing those. I call this, in my new book, it's called The Seed and the Soil. It's the soil is the institutional elements of this thing, and then the seed is the individual elements of it. And both of those are at play in these particular issues. And so, I think that the question is, can we, and I think Representation 2020 is really making a good effort in this, an excellent effort, is can we get to some of these structural issues? Can we get people to understand that changing the structures are actually going to help change, for the better, our democracies and the outcomes of our democracies? Because as you've reflected upon, our outcomes don't look so good right now. So can we make that argument? And Thucydides said people change for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: fear, self-interest, or vision. And however we have to play these 3 elements is to getting people to understand that if we keep going down this road, we're not going to, we're going to have some disasters. Or is there a way that we can actually gain from these changes that are needed so that we do have the closer to parity? And incidentally, I do want to also say that which happens to women in these dynamics are clearly the exact same things that happen to other historically underrepresented groups. So I think it's important to understand that these dynamics are not just hitting women, they're hitting other underrepresented groups also, and that also is hurting our democracy.
And they're hitting other representative groups among women. So all of that is true. A couple things. One is the numbers piece is so important. People in this country believe we are in power, by the way. And so you can't say these numbers often enough. You can't say enough of them. So just getting a report out again and saying, guess what? We haven't made it in terms of these numbers. And I know from the White House project, we used to go into states and we'd say, we want to come in and train your women. And they'd say, we have a training program. I'd say, how many are you training? They'd say, 12 a year. Wait a minute. I'm not kidding. Because we need programs that are training thousands of women. That's how far behind we are. But I do want to say, just in any audience you have or in any supper table you're at, this is what you can do. And I actually have been doing this a while, and so I have magic powers, so this is what you must do. If you have heard this presentation today, and in the next 24 hours, you don't call a woman and that you think might be good at running for office and say, I thought about you when I started this panel today, you should run. I mean, think about this. You know people who should do this, and of course you'll have to do something to help them. But if you don't do it, I can promise you I am magic and something awful will happen to you. And so that's the threat. All right, so moving from the threat onto the next thread, I think that probably we should get Pamela to come up here. Is that right? Oh, Patricia, excuse me. And it's good when you know the names. Patricia, who has also done an amazing job for this project.
So my name is Patricia.
The last name.
Patricia Hart.
Please.
And I just want to say that in the last several decades, women have made great strides entering political office, but there's still a long way to go. And I just want to tell you all a little bit about my personal first political experience. And I was actually in grade school. I was sitting on carpet in my Power Ranger light-up sneakers, and I was watching the television, and the President of the United States was on the television. It was Bill Clinton at the time. And I looked at the screen, and I saw a man, and he had white hair, and he seemed very important, but I was not fixated on that person. I was interested in the woman who was standing to his left and a little bit behind him. I was fixated on her because she looked like my mother, and she looked like my teacher, and she looked more like me. And over a decade later, when I was in college, she was actually running for the presidency herself. And that was Hillary Clinton. And she got she got the most delegates that any other woman candidate has gotten for presidency, or for a presidential nomination. And that's progress. But we still have a lot of progress to make. Now, organizations are doing incredible work. They are training, recruiting, and funding women candidates. They are leveling the playing field as far as funding goes. They are making women feel that they can run for office. Right now, women and men with the same credentials, women are actually half as likely as men to believe that they are very qualified to run for office. And women are twice as likely as men to see themselves as very unqualified to run for office. And these are people who come from the same pool. They have the same credentials. And that's something that we really need to change. I want to introduce somebody who's doing great work on this topic, Jess McIntosh. She works for Emily's List, and she is the communications director, and she will give you a little bit more information on this, and then we'll turn it over to our panel who have done lots of work on training and recruiting women.
Thanks so much, Patricia, and thank you guys for having me here today. It is always so exciting to be in a room full of smart and strong women who are working on promoting women at large. My name is Jess McIntosh. I'm a proud NYU grad, and I am the communications director at Emily's List, which is the nation's largest resource for women in politics. We recruit and we train and we support pro-choice Democratic women up and down the ballot, but I'm going to try to take off of my partisan hat here and talk about the need for women to be better represented at every level of government in both parties, because we'll never reach parity if just one party is pulling their weight. So I'm hoping that we can have a really great conversation about moving forward. One of my favorite things about working at Emily's List is the way that we have approached structural problems throughout our organization's history. We've identified what seems to be the biggest obstacle in the way of having more women in office, and we've attacked that particular one. So historically, we started 28 years ago. In 1985, there wasn't a single Democratic woman elected to the Senate in her own right, not one. We had MTV before we had a Democratic senator elected in her own right. I just want that to sink in a little bit. We are talking about recent history. So 28 years ago, it was really hard for a woman to get taken seriously as a candidate. That meant no party support. That meant no consultants working for her. That meant no money. And as vicious circles work, without money, one can't be considered a viable candidate, and one can't be considered a viable candidate without money. So a number of women were brought together in our founder, Ellen Malcolm's basement. They all brought their Rolodexes. They all talked to their friends. They asked their friends to contribute to the cause of putting more women in office. And they figured out a solution, which was they wrote the checks themselves. Their very first success was just a year later with the election of Senator Barbara Mikulski, who has been one of the most prominent voices in turning around and making sure that women are following her right back up that ladder, which is exactly what we need, and we have a lot of really good women in office doing that now. So the second thing that we identified was that these women needed strong campaigns. Now, men have been networking since the dawn of time, probably, but at least since the dawn of the Republic. Women have really only had about 40 years, 50 years, 40, 30, somewhere in there, to talk to each other about how to get ahead professionally. What are best practices? What are best practices for women? What does that look like? We can talk a lot about mentorship programs, and I know that that's something that's being discussed in this report here, which is fabulous. But we needed, as Emily's List, to be able to tell the women who were considering a run for office what they needed to do first. How can we assess their particular race, because everyone is so different, figure out what advice we can give in terms of hiring a strong staff, building a plan. Men have been doing this for a really long time. There is actually a playbook, and we wanted to make sure that we could share it with the ladies too. I think the third piece, and this is actually representative of a lot of progress. I know we saw some sad statistics up there, but there are things to be optimistic about. Those initial problems that I identified in 1985, they don't exist anymore. Democratic women are seen as viable candidates. Party committees are happy to work with them. Consultants are happy to work with them. People are happy to donate the money, and at least on our side of the aisle, voters are really happy to turn out for them. So what's the problem now is that not enough women are running. So we have to talk about recruitment. I loved what Patricia said about women being less likely to identify themselves as qualified, because it allows me to talk about my favorite statistic, which is Jennifer Lawless from Rutgers does a really great job on this. But she asked a group of men and women to self-identify as unqualified to run for office. And among the men who self-identified as unqualified to run for office, more than half of them would still consider a run. Women's brains don't work that way. So the upside of that is that when we run, we're typically really qualified and we do a very good job. The downside of that is a lot of us don't ever take that first step. So what Emily's List did was develop the Political Opportunity Program, which goes into communities and recruits fabulous women who ought to have been asked 7 and 8 and 9 times already to run for office that simply haven't. I mean, we'll find people, women, who are partners at their law firm, they're on the PTA, they raised all the money for the expansion in the Children's Hospital wing, and they teach Sunday school. We say, have you considered running for office? And they say, why no, what a fabulous idea. If this were a man, everybody and his father would have been telling him to run. So Emily's List finds these fabulous members of these communities. We can particularly focus on communities of color, which is really important. And we then train them. And we're talking about training thousands, not 12. This is a big, burly operation because this is a big, burly job. The other thing that the Political Opportunity Program does is target open seats, which is specifically important that I know you guys are going to talk more about. Women are more likely to run for a seat when it is open and they're not challenging an incumbent. So what Emily's List does is take a really hard look at what seats are coming up, where are people term limited, where are we retired, because we want to make sure whenever there is an open seat, there are fabulous women who are stepping up to run. That's how you build the pipeline. We won't ever have more governors unless we have more speakers of legislatures, unless we have more mayors, unless we're building that pipeline moving all the way up. The final piece of the puzzle is women voters themselves. So Emily's List has a program called Women Vote, where we target women voters. We research them. We find out what they want, what they're doing, what is motivating them this year. We communicate with them, and we do our best to make sure that they make it to the polls. Because when women vote, women win. This is the truth. And in 2012, we saw a historic gender gap favoring Democrats. There were a lot of women showing up to the polls. They voted on behalf of women and families. So 2012 turned out to be a real mandate for women's leadership, because when they turned out to vote, they voted a lot of women into office. So I want to make sure that we're capitalizing on that enthusiasm around women leadership, that we're continuing this conversation, that we're talking about what it means all these executive seats are up in 2014, that we might even be hinting towards 2016 and the need for a first woman president. There is a lot out there in terms of people who want to see more women in office, and I'm thrilled that so many people are having that conversation, so thank you for letting me be a part of it today.
Thank you, It's really hard to have been one of those first women. I feel older than I even know I am. We're sitting in the basement, and you were, I think, the first pollster.
That's right.
There's a lot of history here. And a lot of what Jess is in charge of there and what we are talking about in this report has to do with how we fuel women's political ambition, how we really look at how media treats women still, the kind of stuff that still goes on that punches that ambition down. And nobody knows more about that than you. This is somebody that if anybody were to run for office, they would covet. They would just say, give me 3 inches a day, and I would come along.
That's very generous. Thank you very much. Well, I think Jess's presentation has been absolutely fabulous, and the study as well. And I want to say that all of these pieces, and I see Denise there, who's head of the Women's Vote Project, which is a real passion of mine, so I want to acknowledge her as well. And I think you laid it out very, very well. One thing I would say, and because Kellyanne isn't here, one thing I would add to the equation is that we often and Jess was very careful in her language saying it was a good year for us, it was a good year for Democrats, it was not a good year for Republican women. And one of the challenges that we face is when you have someone of the stature of Olympia Snowe deciding not to run because of what she'll face in her primary as a woman and as a moderate, then I think we all lose. And so one of the things that we've really, really seen is that thanks to Emily's List and a number of other forces, we have a lot of recruitment going on the Democratic side, still not fast enough, but a lot of strategic recruitment going on the Democratic side in terms of recruiting women, but we don't have enough going on the Republican side. And where the average Democratic woman will still tend to win her primary, and somewhere between 56 and 59% of voters in primaries on the Democratic side are female. The same is not true for the Republican women. And then when you talk about moderate Republican women or pro-choice Republican women who would have a women's agenda as well, you're talking about people who have a very, very difficult time getting out of the Republican primary anymore. And because of the deep, first the born-again Christian faction and then the Tea Party faction, neither one of these factions has been that positive about women on the Republican side. So because Kellyanne couldn't be here, one thing I think that we have to think about is there are just seats that are going to be won by Republicans or seats that Democrats aren't going to win. And we need to be sure that we all work to get women nominated and successful in those Republican seats as well, to make sure that the full range of women are represented and their voices are represented. And then that when we get our Democratic women in, they have someone to work with across the aisle, because as we know, women do tend to work together more. And they do, and there's a very fascinating chapter of the decline of women's leadership and the decline of women's caucuses in the report, and I think it's a very undernoted and important factor that you all have pointed out, that we need to give these women our women, someone to work with on the other side. And Olympia Snowe was someone that did cross the aisle and that you could make those differences with. That said, I think as you come down, and I think Jess said some very important things, and it leads, I think, to the third part of this report. And Maria will smile at me because when she founded the White House Project, which I was wildly in favor of, it had two parts. It had a voter part and a cultural part, and it had a structural part too. And I have to say that I was less enthusiastic about the structural part. I thought, we're never going to get the rules changed here. We're a presidential system. We're single-member districts. Well, I have come around, and there's just no way we can make the kind of progress we need to make, frankly, without the structural changes. Now, it's still as hard as it was when we started to think about them, but when you have 98% of incumbents returning, and you don't have multi-member districts, you don't have proportional representation, you don't have quotas within parties, and of course the quota word is the bad word in our country, even though it's accepted all over the place, everywhere else, particularly that women have made success. Then we really have a problem, and I think probably the most important chapter in the book, because it's the place we least understand how to get started, is the structural chapter. That is if Emily's List always identifies the most important problems, well, maybe today we announce the NYU the Parity Emily's List partnership on proportional representation or something, because it's hard to imagine how we make the kind of progress that we need to make without making some structural changes. And the decline of parties, which we thought might open up the system, actually hasn't been good for us. It's been harder to get the women nominated with the decline of parties. We thought that term limits, I'm totally against term limits. We thought term limits might help with women. They've helped with young people. They've helped with Latino candidates. They have not helped with women or African American candidates. In fact, they've taken what it takes 25 years to build up and decimated it after 6 years. And we've seen a pretty stark, term limits more than anything else can explain the stagnation in these state legislatures, because now every 6 years we have to rebuild from scratch. So I think that the next biggest problem is the structural issue, and it's a hard one, and I have some voter data on that when we come to that discussion, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Well, I think I want to just say that one of the things that happens in any issue like this, is, as you were, I think, bringing it in very well with corporate, is that I want to remind you that we have tried for 200, 300 years to fix women. I mean, our work has been fixing women. If we just get women to run right, if we get them to dress right, if we get enough, blah, blah, blah. And that's why she said the structural issues that we took on, where you got to have numbers of women, because only numbers actually do away with gender and push people to look at agendas. But that's why I'm on in this work, because I think we're dealing with structural issues. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I also want to remind you of is working across party. I see that as a structural issue. And I just love it when Gail Collins in the New York Times writes about Patty Murray being able to pass, finally a budget, because women work across the parties. And that's a structural issue that we aren't addressing, but we have to address in terms of Republican, because you have to work. And then I hope that you saw the picture of Barbara Mikulski on the front. I'm sorry, I'm a New Yorker. On the front of the New York Times recently, because she was saying to John McCain, Senator McCain, please go home and read this thing so you can vote intelligently. And McCain went home. And I think this is the only person that could tell John McCain to go home. But at any rate, I mean, this is the reason we have to have this done. And Laura has so much experience with this in other countries. She's the expert.
Well, about that. But I definitely want to echo this issue around the structural, even though it's probably the highest hurdle to deal with. Because, for example, Pippa Norris has some research from the Kennedy School where she has identified that no country has gotten to critical mass in its parliament, its national body, without some affirmative mechanism in place. And over 100 countries have some affirmative mechanism. That is not necessarily, quote, a quota. That may be what they call the zipper, which is every other position, every other nominee has to be male-female. I was fascinated by the Swedish Parliament. The Swedish Parliament, for example, would go until 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, midnight, and then they got to a critical mass of women in the Swedish Parliament, and the women said, we're leaving at 6. And of course, there was critical mass, so they had enough women to actually do that. Of course, most of the men were thrilled, but it wasn't the archetype for men to be able to say, we want to leave at 6 o'clock, but they were thrilled when that happened. And there are data points now that are showing what happens when you get to a critical mass of women. One of the ones that fascinates me, again, on the corporate side of things, is that Norway now mandates that 40% of corporate board seats must be of the opposite gender, which is how the law reads. But because there are so few women, it means 40% women. And if the public corporation doesn't get to 40% women on its corporate board, it's delisted from the Norwegian Stock Exchange. So they couldn't find any women before the law. Amazing how quickly they found women after the law. But what's interesting to me, whether you actually agree with that mechanism or not, is what's interesting is the research that's now coming out of this, now that there is a critical mass. A couple of things have happened that they've observed. First off, they've observed that women read the board materials.
Right.
What can I tell you? Second, they've observed that more of the board decisions are being made within the boardroom, not nightclub, golf course, country club. So transparency levels are actually going up in the process. 3, women ask more questions, which is a social dynamic that women often do, but it's an interesting one. 4, they've observed that men will have a tendency to look at the short term impacts of board decisions. Women will have a tendency to look at the long-term impact of board decisions. Now, of course, diversity will tell you that the best boards look at short-term and long-term, which is why you need, this balance. They've also observed that men will have a tendency to look at the shareholder impact of board decisions. Women will have a tendency to look at the stakeholder impact of board decisions. Stakeholders are employees, environment, communities, etc. Again, best boards look at shareholder and stakeholder. So it's just an interesting example of what happens when you get to this sort of controlled experiment of critical mass. And so I think these are valuable for us to look at, not just particularly going down the road of affirmative mechanisms, but what does happen when we do these kinds of things. I think also in terms of what Celinda was talking about, and also Jess, your great presentation. Where'd Jess go? Oh, there you are. You decided to hide up there. Terrific presentation around this whole issue of ambition, or how women perceive themselves versus how men perceive themselves. Anna Fels, in her book Necessary Dreams, talks about the fact that, in fact, men and women actually have the same level of ambition.
All right.
But what's hard for women is to actually express that ambition, publicly. So, in other words, if women write down what their ambition is, it's different than what they say their ambition is in front of others, because of the social negative consequence that you get by showing your ambition publicly. So that tells me that women have that ambition. They're just not being able to reflect on it. And then they develop things which are called disarming mechanisms, which are things like ritual modesty and ritual mitigation. A classic example of this is a woman will say, after she's been in office, 20 years, well, I'm not the expert on this, but I have an idea. That's a ritual mitigation, ritual modesty comment. She is, of course, the expert on it, but she's saying this so she won't get social negative consequence and blowback from other people about being too ambitious. So there's just sort of social dynamics that are going on that you referenced, Jess, on that. In addition, I think this whole media issue is really an incredibly important one, and getting more and more. I mean, the media is the largest purveyor of archetypes that we have, and it's getting larger. It's getting larger. If any of you have seen the film Misrepresentation, that will talk about that, about how women are represented in the movies, etc. Gina Davis and her media foundation is doing some really excellent work. She's looking at gender roles and race roles. She's looking at who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, who's the hero, etc. And lots of different research on that. She's looked at 2,000 G-rated movies and found, for example, that crowd scenes, which you would expect to be 50% women and 50% men, approximately, crowd scenes, 2,000 G-rated movies, 86% men, 14% women in crowd scenes. Now, that is unconsciously telling you who's entitled to be in the public sphere and who should be in the private sphere. It's telling you that. Of the top 200 movies, just recently released 200 movies, women had 28% of the speaking roles. So when you start uncovering this kind of thing, then it shouldn't be surprising to you that you have some of these kinds of social constructs that we have. But these are the kinds of things that really actually need to be looked at, and that's why the report itself includes this whole issue of gender stereotyping in it, along with the importance of the structural changes.
Before I bring Andrea back up here, I do want to say that one of the things we specialized in with the White House Project, which can be done in any community, is to really bring in different movies, to bring in things that show women as leaders, to really use culture. Because we went up and begged ABC, to make something, and finally they made Commander-in-Chief, and we did a little bit to get it out for about 6 weeks. But, it's hard to get one on there. But there are more things now. Their documentary is big. And so we need to think about how in every community you could start a documentary film festival, about women's leadership, and culture matters. But I want to run on because we need to get to one of the most important parts. So.
So thank you for your introduction on structural reforms that FairVote really supports. We think that there are multiple approaches to increasing the number of women in elected office. We have to deal with the pipeline and deal with getting more women recruited and running for office, but we also need to deal with election structure and go about recruiting women. So I'll start by telling you a little story about a state called Wyoming, which ranked 11th in the nation for the percentage of women in its state legislature in 1993. Today it's 44th. There are a lot of reasons that could have gone into that decline, but one of them is that in 1992, Iowa redistricted and went from the use of multi-member districts, which is when multiple legislators represent one district, to single-member districts, which is what we see in the U.S. House of Representatives today, where one legislator represents one district. And when you look at different states across the country, 10 use multi-member districts to elect their state legislatures. They tend to rank pretty well for their percentage of women in their legislatures. Of the top 11 states for their percentage right now, 6 of them use multi-member districts. So 6 of the 10 that use multi-member districts are in the top 11 of states, which is good. And also overall, you find that legislative chambers that use multi-member districts tend to have 31% women sitting in seats, and in single-member district chambers, it's only 22%. So we think that this is incredibly important to discuss and also to expand into the conversation about increasing women's representation. So at FairVote, we're interested in incorporating multi-seat districts that are used in 10 different states, but also using a fair voting system for it, because we believe that that everyone should have fair representation in government. So what we try to do is combine multi-seat districts with proportional voting systems, or fair representation voting, which are American forms of proportional representation. They're candidate-based. You vote for a candidate. But you find that both political and racial minorities are able to elect candidates of choice, and also that we'll have multi-member districts, and that will get more women elected. But also important when discussing election structure is the role that political parties play in recruiting women. There have been a ton of studies about this. You find across the board that political parties are more likely to encourage men to run than to encourage women to run. They're more likely to discourage women to run than men. But women are more likely to take encouragement very seriously to run for office. You find that men are much more likely to be self-starters, to just decide to run for office without any prompting. But when a party official prompts a woman to run for office, she seriously considers it. So one thing that we're interested is looking at what countries do abroad with affirmative mechanisms by political parties to get more women recruited. A lot of parties abroad have more control over who is nominated by their party, whereas in America we use popular primaries, so the voter decides who the party nominee is. But political parties do have a lot of control over who they recruit to run in those primaries. So what we want to see is more political parties setting goals for how many women they'll recruit for open seat elections, and meeting those goals, and then if they meet that goal, potentially being rewarded for it. And lastly, what we're interested in is looking within legislatures to see what both state legislators themselves can do and what legislatures, what practices they can implement that would be helpful to women. So you've heard issues about women who in Sweden were not pleased with the hours of their legislature meeting. We want state legislatures to look at that too. We want them to look at how any of their activities might be biased against women. And we're also interested in looking at how women can help each other in women's caucuses and in mentoring groups, things like that, so that once women get to office, they can really springboard off into leadership positions and really become the effective legislators that they have the absolute potential to be. So I'd love our panelists to talk a little bit about how they see electoral structure as important in increasing women's representation and how they think that might apply to American government.
I just want to say that Andrew Levian, is it correct? Yes. Levian and Patricia Hart are amazing women. I mean, this is a radical report, and I would appreciate it. Beautifully done. Really well done and well presented. Now we're down to the things that I think could make an enormous difference, and this is really a piece of history we are here discussing, because very few people in this country are talking about structural changes. This is a conversation that could change, finally, our democracy. I'm not talking about changing women or men. I'm talking about changing our democracy to being a real democracy. So I'll start with, again, you, in terms of...
Thank you. Well, I think actually Laura's the expert, honestly.
Yeah, because I should start with you. Well, we should start with Laura, because...
She really has studied internationally.
Well,
and I think that is, what did you call that, mitigation?
Ritual mitigation.
I think that's ritual modesty.
Ritual modesty.
She is the expert. We should recognize it.
No, but it's not at all.
Wait a minute.
All right, I'm the expert on it.
God, talk about this is what we're trying to fix, girls.
Right.
Okay.
Right,
No, actually, yes.
Yes.
We have tried. All of us have tried to get structural changes.
Right.
I mean, I have been outrageous by trying to say, what if we called it quotas? Would you feel better about it? Because quotas doesn't do it. But there has to be something that moves this. And
there does.
The modest Laura Liswood will talk to you
well,
about this.
there definitely has to be some change here, because the current structures that we have in place seem to be moving further and further away, for women and for other groups. In addition, the whole issue, and we haven't even talked about it, nor I don't think we will get into it that much, but voter access, the voter ID laws, et cetera, like that, will certainly have a chilling effect on historically underrepresented groups. And so, all of these things are sort of heading us in the wrong direction. And so then the real question becomes, what will be the sort of leverage point for us? What will be the kind of thing? Because in other countries, these leverage points have occurred, where people will say, this is just not working for us, we need to change the system. And often you will find with the women heads of state and government, and currently there are 48 living women presidents and prime ministers, current and former. And most of them are in systems that are structured differently. They're what we would call proportional representation systems or parliamentary systems. So our system is very unfriendly to historically out-of-power groups to get in. Because if you have to do that 50+1, winner-take-all system, it's much harder than getting into coalition with 30% of the vote and getting into coalition with other groups, et cetera. Now, I'm not sure we're going to get that far, but I think it's very helpful to look at what other countries are doing to get ideas around this kind of thing. In addition, there are some fundamental elements. I mean, I think Rob Ritchie, who runs FairVote, was talking about the fact that what is one of the major impacts for women wanting to run is the average distance from the legislative place, which has to do that. I was reminded when I interviewed Margaret Thatcher, who was definitely not much of a feminist, but she told me that, for women, it would be harder to run for office when they were younger, because they would want to be taking care of their children, and they wouldn't be running for office. Not realizing that she just embedded a discrimination, because the parliamentary system in Great Britain is seniority-based, as is most of our systems here, seniority-based. So she embedded in that. Now, she, of course, had twins, which I think she thought was quite efficient in terms of her approach to this. But other leaders, for example, Mary Robinson, the first woman president of Ireland, came to her position strictly because it was a 1-2-3 voting system that they had in place. So I think we are absolutely, I think FairVote and Representation 2020 and the people who are working on are absolutely spot on right to look at these structural issues. On the other hand, I don't think we can disregard the other dynamics that are going on, particularly I think this whole issue around what the parties can do, and the kind of pressure that can be put onto parties and the women's caucuses, or the caucuses that support. Because if someone is telling you what the unwritten rules are, as you come to office, and someone is not telling someone else what the unwritten rules are, then the person who gets those unwritten rules is likely to be much more effective as a legislator. And unfortunately, the people who tell the other people the unwritten rules are like to like. If you're like me, I'm likely to tell you these kinds of things. If you're not like me, I'm not likely to tell you these kinds of things. So why should we then be surprised if the not likes don't do so well, in systems? And what we see and I think we're seeing this also here, is certainly in the corporate world, we're seeing that, for example, for women, it's not an intake problem anymore. Women are coming into the corporate system at quite high percentages. It's an upgrade problem. Can't get them up. And I think we see some of the same dynamics going on here.
I think that's true. I think you've got more women trying to get up, though, than we've got trying to get up in the corporate world, and we've got trying to get up in politics, back to that numbers piece, because it's more discouraging. Celinda.
So I would say a couple of things. First of all, this is the one area, and we've done some testing on this. I think there needs to be a lot more explanation and exploration of it. But voters have learned kind of some basic principles. They know, majority rule. They know one person, one vote. They know the presidential system, and they believe that this is the absolute best system. This is the American system. Nothing could be better. And even when we pose some arguments for change, like this will allow more representation, more different kinds of voices being heard, people are like, no, we don't want that. We don't. And then twist. Excuse me. Backwards, even trying to defend the existing system as the best system. It's also a very interesting time to have this conversation, because it is in some ways the best of times in some ways the worst of times. So in one way, it's the worst of times because people think America's on the decline generally. So we're going to have the best voting system no matter what. We are not. We tested messages around voter ID and some of these other very, very bad reforms that are going on. And we tested, we don't have the best democracy in the world. We need to live up to that ideal. And people said, no, we don't have the best economy in the world. We don't have the best anything in the world. Gosh darn it, we're still going to maintain the best democracy in the world. We're going to insist we have the best democracy no matter how many facts you share with us. So people are very tied to the American system because they think that we're in decline on so many other things. We're going to hold on to this. The second piece, though, that's interesting is people think the system is really not working. The distrust and dysfunction in our system is at an all-time high. So I think it's a very interesting question. Can we channel that dysfunction and that distrust and dislike for what's going on to a different community-based conversation? And I wonder if there isn't NYU. I think it's interesting to be an academic setting. Can academics across the country start a different conversation going about what kind of system we have and what kind of system would serve us best? And are there changes we can make? Certainly the right has done that. The conservative forces have done that. They've prompted a conversation about voter ID. Many people will tell you in most states there isn't much of a fraud problem. This is a solution. This is the garbage can model of policymaking. It's a solution looking for a problem. And yet people decided what they wanted in the system and then latched onto other dialogues to make it happen. The second thing I think is that we ought to start a conversation with young people. I mean, people in our education systems really do talk about, they really do learn some core values. Now, they don't learn very much about the third branch of government because the judiciary system is always taught in the spring when people can't wait to get out from school. And as Kellyanne once did research that found more people knew snap, crackle, pop than knew 3 justices on the Supreme Court. But that said, kids are learning throughout our system. What if we went to social studies teachers? What if we went to our early educators and said, our girls and boys clubs, and said, let's try some different dialogues. Let's try proportional representation. Let's try ranked voting. Let's see if we can get a conversation going among young people about some different kinds of systems and some different kinds of approaches here in terms of the best ways to get things represented. The third thing I think is, there are 2 structural features that I would love to have added to your report. So maybe you get funded now for the second chapter of your report. The first one, campaign finance, which I've already mentioned. The second one is the culture, and there's no greater expert on this than Marie, but I think if we're really going to change this conversation, it is the cultural change. It happens much, much faster than the political change. And I think all of this work that the White House Project did, and I'll never forget going in and talking with Marie about presidential Barbie, and she's kind of laughing with me, and she goes, how can the head of Ms. go in and talk about presidential Barbie? I said, if the average girl in America has 13 Barbies, one of them ought to be running for president. So Marie went in and did that battle and got presidential Barbie and a Girl Scout patch to run for president and girls and boys clubs. But we need to think as a structural feature about how to change the cultural conversation. And just I love the fact that you said that MTV came before a woman senator. Maybe if MTV had been talking about a woman senator, we would have had one first, faster. So thinking about where we talk about the cultural conversation as a structural feature.
I agree.
And certainly the conservatives are very aware of this as a force. But I think us as progressives are less used to actually thinking about how do we use culture. And now when there's so many channels, so much social media, so many movies, on so many documentaries, so many independent films, we can access the cultural channels so much easier now than we used to be able to do. But we're having a hard time. We still don't have a really vibrant, we have Lifetime and we have O, but we don't have the women's networks nearly what we would like them to have been. Women's dominate the early morning Today programs, but I'm sure that if you guys went and said, well, let's talk about Hillary for president, that'd be a great Today Show episode, if we said, let's go talk about proportional representation, they go, what? Proportional what? Are you sure that's legal? Is that a pornography representation? What is that? So trying to think about how we have a cultural conversation, and I'd love to see the next report go on and think about, and particularly I think in the hands of young women, they're going to promote the cultural conversation even more than anybody can.
I completely agree. It will change. I mean, culture comes first. It reaches people here. It reaches them where they're afraid, and this one's probably one they're afraid of. I'm going to bring Cynthia back up, but I want to say a word while she's coming up about this area. Rob and Cynthia and others have been working on this for a long time, actually. It's a time really has come. It's not one of those things that's easy and popular, which is why it would be great to get it out in popular culture. But there is all these things that we talk about in terms of fueling women's ambition and changing the ways that we get women to run and et cetera. All of these things that have been hard for us can be solved. But if we don't change the structure, if we don't do what actually FairVote is talking about doing, we will never get there, because there's no way without changing the structure that this will happen. And so I'm glad Cynthia's coming up, and I think we should applaud them actually for being pioneers, because this is one of those things that later people will say, oh my God, who were those people? I do.
They were all of you and all of us, it turns out, here together. Thank you so much. Fabulous panel. And I'm assuming some people in our fabulous audience will have some good questions for them. In closing a little bit about Representation 2020, I wanted to reaffirm how important it is to talk about all partisan reform, and how leveling the playing field in an election system means that everybody has access to have representation in proportion to their share of the electorate. So we are so glad that Celinda was able to speak a little bit on behalf of Kellyanne Conway, who's her, I don't know whether you call her your GOP friend and comrade, and we're really looking forward to engaging with people from all parts of the spectrum of political thought, because obviously it's a wide spectrum. It's not just one aisle that separates A and B, but there are many parts of that spectrum. So we're glad for that conversation, and I wanted to also mention that we're very glad for the important work of many organizations. Andrea and Patricia drew on great research that's been done by key academics in their field, key organizations, but perhaps the single most important source of our report is the Center for American and Women in Politics. So our hats off to them for collecting this data year after year, compiling statistics on women in elected office and in multi-seat districts in this country. And what we are hoping to do is elevate the conversation so that all of the great work that's being done gets more attention from the morning show. Perhaps we'll have a whole segment on proportional representation. We'll be putting that on our agenda. So I'll start this 10 or 15 minute question period with a question to our panelists, which is, what reform would you look for in the coming year as we count down to the centennial of suffrage in 2020? We're hoping to start really measuring our success and our progress, and I'm curious to know what each of you are looking for in the next year before we publish the next edition of our report. What can we put in there that emerges as a real positive development?
Well, I think that's really hard. I'm not sure that anything will change in the next year, to be really honest with you. A lot of legislatures are out, so it's hard to change them. So if we were thinking about something we could get done in a year, I think that perhaps what we could do is come together, and I can't think of anyone besides you and Marie leading this more ably, then I think we could implement some cultural awareness in the next year. I think we could sit down and with social studies teachers, for example, and we could get a different module. We could, have schools experiment with a different kind of student election, or just see if the results would be different. We could have a first grade class, all first grade teachers introduce, well, let's vote this way and let's vote this way, and see what difference it makes. So I think maybe an educational change, and maybe a cultural change, sitting down with writers in Hollywood and some film writers are really talking about. I think it'll be ripe as we prepare. My fingers are certainly crossed, but as we prepare for perhaps a woman president, I think we could have a lot of cultural interest in some things maybe a little bit better than the Clinton episodes to lead the way in terms of women's representation. Really use it. I mean, when Geraldine Ferraro ran, that really boosted women's participation. Then 1992 did the same thing. 2010 laid some groundwork in that we had record numbers of Democratic women, unfortunately not Republican women, elected. But I think in the face of Republicans looking at perhaps the Hillary, I bet they'll have a woman VP. I bet they will nominate a lot of women because they will be afraid of that force and losing in those numbers. And I think that there might be some cultural things that we could get going in the next year or two that wouldn't be as hard to sell jobs. And then the last thing I'd say, and of course the pollster would say this, I think we need some really serious polling and message work on these structural reforms. Yeah. We know how to convince people that a woman is qualified. We know how to convince women to write a bigger check for a woman candidate. What we don't know is how to sell proportional representation, right, multi-member districts to the public. And we have done enough research to know it is a very tough sell. Rank order voting actually is something that is popular with voters, but the rest has not been. So, of course, a pollster would suggest, I think we need a research project on this to figure out how to message it to the public.
Excellent. You know, building on that, one of the things that I think we forget, and I'm reminded every time I'm with the two of you, or four of you, is that this has happened before. This has been recently. There have been states that have these kind of things. I mean, that have had, and they worked, and some that do have, and they worked. And so I think we need to actually talk to people about, so it's not like, oh, look what these people are doing, but look, this was common sense. Why did we get away from this? Because people are really not amused about what's going on right now. Right. And so if they see something that can make a difference in terms of people who would run differently, be able to win differently, and I think we should go to somebody like Frank Rich, who actually writes on Veep. I mean, Veep is funny, but Veep, I mean, it would be, you know, it'd be fun to see Veep talking about, this is a terrible way to vote, you know, or something. Yeah. But, I mean, even if it was funny, we got House of Cards. I mean, get on some show, get it mentioned on some shows about, funny or not, where it is, because we could do that. And I think we talked about something that has to do with caucuses that could get done. That if we tried to look at whether there are caucuses in the different legislatures for women, so that women have a bigger voice, we could get that done.
I would definitely agree with this whole issue of this awareness. I mean, we're all aware, but people out there are not.
You've got to get it out.
And I would think even some testimonials from the average voter who has voted in a rank order system.
That'd be great.
You know, to talk about, you know, this was confusing to me at first, but then I saw what happened, etc. You know, just the average voter who can then appeal to others and to understand that. I mean, I do think that education needs to be.
It's a great idea. And New Jersey, of course, going to have their elections this year. We could have November testimonials out of it.
Yeah. I mean, Oakland, we know where their vote knows exactly where, because they've been working on all of these kinds of things. So I think this awareness turns out to be key. And you know, then there, of course, is this whole issue of encouraging. I mean, Emily's List has been doing this. You were doing this. It's you know, encouraging women to run for office, but maybe getting a commitment, a pledge, if you will, from some of the women in the legislatures to say, yes, I will identify 5 women. I will ask 5 women. I agree with
that. I've been thinking about that.
To run, because you know, one of the most important elements of this whole thing is called what I call the power of the mirror. Knowing who it is you can be by who it is you see.
That's right.
You know, and this came home to me when I interviewed the president of Iceland, who had been President Vigdis Finnbogadóttir of Iceland. She'd been president for 16 years. She told me after she was in office about 8 years, she was going around Iceland talking to the children. And one of the things she noticed was that for the children under 8, they all thought only a woman could be president of Iceland. And that the boys had to ask if they could be president of Iceland, because they had never seen it. They had never seen a male president. So this power of the mirror, I think, is really essential. And, of course, that ties into the cultural things that you're talking about.
Great. Yes. Hi. I think you need to wait for a mic to come down. And I would say try to keep questions short so we can have as many in our few minutes as possible. There'll be more time to talk at the brief reception afterwards, but identify yourselves quickly and then ask questions.
Hi, Kaylin Crawford. I work in violence prevention against women and girls. And in the violence prevention field, we have an effort to engage men and boys to bring them on board in pushing it and seeing it as not a women and girls issue. What would you say is the analogy for engaging men and boys to see greater gender parity as also an everybody issue and a men and boys issue as well?
That's a great question. I mean, a couple of things we know. First of all, we know that men are as disgusted as women by the current results or lack thereof. So if you're talking about articulating change, and the number one thing that people want are legislative bodies to come more together. And it's one of the number one things that people think that women provide is more consensus building. Right. And I think these bipartisan caucuses would be an interesting thing to try to promote too. The second thing I think is that when male legislators, and COP has done some very interesting research on this, when male legislators are asked how things run with women in the legislative bodies, they say better. They like the 6 o'clock hours. They like, let's get down to business. The more cooperative, the more let's base this on fact. Let's not just restate party positions, et cetera. Can we find some common ground? Can we take this part of the bill and pass it even if we can't agree on this part of the bill or whatever it is? They also say that women bring in more representatives of the constituencies, that women will bring in more the voices of their constituents. Well, that's incredibly powerful. So I think there's a lot here that can work. And then, the formula, women voters are very important to the formula for both sides of the aisle, right? So the Democratic formula is you have to win women by more than you lose men by. And the Republican formula is you can't alienate those women as much as we did in 2010. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the way they summarize it now. So I think that appealing to women voters and younger women, and I think both parties are going to become more active in recruiting women. And Sarah Palin, to her credit, the Mama Grizzlies, she did recruit women. The problem is that they make it more through the Democratic primaries than they do the Republican primaries.
Yes?
If these
Can you? Oh, sorry.
Oh, she's right here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks. I appreciate your observation about the president of Iceland, and I think that one of the things we should be looking at is that whole idea, the educational component that our kids have been missing. You shouldn't have to wait until women's studies class in college to learn about women's lives. And I think as a former teacher, I experienced personal pushback from the kids who said, well, why can't we just do a report on a president? Why can't we just do a report on an inventor? Why do we have to do a report on a woman? Why can't we just do a report on an athlete? Why do we have to do a report on a woman? Could have been a woman athlete, But because they don't have that context in the lower grades, you really need to be sending out lists to the lower grade teachers, because that's where the kids, get their very, very basic on things. And also, we need to be looking at the iconography of our society. If you look around at 99% of the statues in the DC area, they're all old white guys, and we need to address that as well as the crowds in the movies and the cartoon characters that are predominantly male. Thanks very much.
Yeah, if the two major structural changes that have been talked about, PR and ranked choice voting, were instituted, one could argue that it would have an even bigger effect on the political parties and maybe create more opportunities for independents and third parties, which I'm strongly in favor of, to emerge. And I wondered if you could speak to that, maybe the role of women in leading us beyond Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that people are very hungry for. It's more independent and third parties. And you're right, there's a lot structurally in our system that forces them in. The third parties have not been great about nominating women, actually, which is interesting. The Green Party's been the best, and the Green Party, Laura can speak to this better than I can, has been quite good in Europe as well. But I do think that's exactly right. It would allow for more independent and third-party voices, and that would probably help also increase women's participation and people of color's participation and other points of view participation.
I think that's absolutely right. And to your point, I think you can meld those 2 points, which is what's in it for men, what's in it for boys, as it were, which is that a lot of people don't want to have to vote to the extremes. Mm-hmm. You know, they want to be able to vote more in the middle, more independent, if you will. You know, but the current system is pushing us further and further to these extremes, and particularly around the primaries. And so to that extent that this would help ameliorate that issue. Now, you raise a very interesting underlying question, which is that, you know, what's in it for me, right, which is what am I going to lose?
Right.
You know,
right.
And part of the problem is that when you change that structure, you are actually potentially diminishing the power of the 2 major parties.
Right.
And you know,
well, that's the problem.
I know that's a supporting point, but you know,
it makes you an enemy.
You understand where I'm coming from in terms of who wins, who loses,
right,
in this.
And some people who lose have a great deal of power still. But I think what's interesting about it is it would be good to shake them up, because there are a lot of people that are like a pox on both your houses, and we need something to shake it up that's real, that has real value.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we need to close. Oh, this person in the back has had their hand up for quite a while.
Yeah, my name is Joe Freeman. I've been writing about women in politics for over 30 years. When you look at the data on women in the legislatures and women in Congress, what stands out is that there is a party gap that has developed in the last 20 years. Yet we seem to talk about women getting into the legislatures and more representation as though it were a generic problem. Realistically, women have been making steady progress in the Democrats. In the Republicans, they peaked, flattened out, and declined in the 2000s. Now, I'm not going to give you a lot of data, and I'm sure those of you at the front of the room know exactly what I'm talking about, and you also know that historically, go back enough decades, it was the other way around. What I don't understand is why no one is willing to talk about the party gap. We sort of brush over it as though it's not really there, except for worth maybe a minor mention. I think examining it would lead us to some very interesting insights, because the parties are not identical, either intrinsically or in the way they treat women. They have different cultures, different structures, different social bases. There's quite a bit that's different about them. And understanding the party gap and how women have done, respectively, in the Democratic and Republican Party would give us a lot of insight. So why don't we talk about it more?
I just want to say this is a historical figure that we have in this room, and to thank her for her work. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's so hard to talk about it because it is the central conversation that is unsaid and happening right now. I'll be very honest with you. We ran a progressive nonpartisan project, but Republican women, I was a colleague of Mary Louise Smith, who is one of the chairs, the only woman who's ever been chair of the Republican Party. And at that time, there was not that much difference between the parties. There was some social difference, but it wasn't the kind of differences that we have now. But what I think we do have to start to talk about, I mean, maybe we aren't saying how few Republican women in our office, how many Republican women would come up to me and say, I'm looking for a place to be. I'm looking for a place to be. And so we do have to have that conversation. I think what we don't want to do is to turn women against each other, or turn against a group of women who I think are looking, who have a different perspective, but I always think there are many women in the Republican Party who are really, quote, not necessarily happy about this. But I think Republican women have to do that work to some extent. And I think that's the hard thing
to talk about it without saying who could talk with you about it, because all of us have had side conversations. That sounded very inarticulate, I'm sorry. But it's a hard issue. Does somebody else want to take it on? So I'm not.
I think you said it right, which is it's a harder conversation to have as the Republican Party has moved more right.
Yeah.
It was an easier conversation to have because, I mean, you know, on my side of the aisle, we say Michelle Bachmann is a man in drag. I mean, we can't even envision her as a woman because her views are so antithetical to everything that Democrats perceive as. But I think you asked, you reframed it for me, and I think it's a very interesting question. Yeah. And that is structurally, let's look at these two parties. Why are people getting out of the Democratic primary and women aren't getting out of the Republican primaries? Why are Democratic women? Why did Emily's wildly successful and wish list in trouble or non-existent really?
Right.
So I think that looking at this from a structural perspective, and on the Democratic side we joke, we say we come from no organized party. We're Democrats. The Republicans pride themselves on their organization. So, is there something there in the looser structure? And does that suggest something about third parties and nomination procedures, et cetera? So I think that you suggested a frame that it's going to be easier to have this conversation when it's ideological. I worked for the Bipartisan Women's Campaign Fund, my first job when I came to Washington, my first political job, and but it's a really hard. There were a lot of pro-choice Republican women. We supported them. They don't exist anymore, and it's really hard to ask women. Right, but they're not running for office. They don't exist as candidates. No. They do exist, but not as candidates. So reframing this as a structural conversation, I think, is a really new way to have this conversation that doesn't get into these difficulties. Great point. Thank you for everything you've written, including everything I've read in graduate school.
To remember that, we have a vested interest in having diverse ideas out there. Suppressing ideas is not. All research just shows you that the more diversity you have in both people and ideas, the more likely it is you're going to come up with innovation and creativity. So we all have a vested interest in ensuring that voices get heard.
True.
You're here.
Wow.
Thank you.
Now we're radical.